I will briefly talk about NDC finance strategies, but also more broadly about the NDC as an ecosystem as a whole. So my role is I act as a senior advisor to the country teams producing the NDC finance strategies and other documents related to the NDCs. In the EU for Climate project. I started in this role last month, and I will be working with the team over the course of the next year. So next slide, please. Right, so I think it's really important that we look at NDCs as a form of an ecosystem, really, of a range of interconnected documents and actions by a number of actors. So that does obviously include the government, it includes UN agencies, the conventions, commitments that have been made under these conventions. And it also includes the development partners who will ultimately have to finance the projects. So conceptually, you can see that here for the NDC update, it's a document that will be produced that itself is relatively short, but that hopefully rests on a wide range of pillars that provide solid support and a foundation for its implementation. And its implementation is ultimately going to depend on both the government, private sector, and sort of international support action in the countries in the Eastern Partnership. Next slide, please. So the other really important conceptual difference that I see here is that we had the first NDCs in 2015, and now everybody is scrambling to produce updates to these NDCs. And a lot of underlying documentation is being prepared. But the benefit we have in this round is we are now tying these NDCs into long-term low emissions development strategies. We're tying them into national adaptation plans. And we are also tying them into, in many countries, clearly defined action plans. So instead of, therefore, treating the NDC as as an event that comes around every 5 years because the Paris Agreement says so, I think it's quite important to consider it rather as a continuous process that is fully integrated into government policy making and decision making, where you commence implementation, you analyze how that's going, you amend sector studies that underlie the NDC, you update them, you reflect projects that have happened, new projects that are emerging. You refine the long-term development plans accordingly, revise the objectives to have a new NDC, and then you do that again. So, rather than having the mad scramble that we're currently in, really go through it on a continuous basis, make it part of the way that the country is being run, and fully integrate climate into your decision making. Next slide, please. Sorry, can you go to the next slide, please? No, something seems to have happened.
Moment, something happened, I think.
Right, there we go. There we are. So, coming to the finance strategies, and these are pretty much missing across the region still, and they either haven't even been started or they are in the course of development. So what do we expect to see in them? Well, it's first of all, the finance that we already know has been committed in support of the NDC, both from public and private sources and national and international sources as well. We expect to see the finance gaps. So what is missing, what hasn't been financed yet that is needed to deliver the NDC. And we expect to see an identification of where the money is going to come from to fill the gaps. And with all of that, we will then have an overview of investment requirements over time. And also we'll get an overview of how much of this investment is expected to be covered by donors. And I'm using donors here in the widest possible sense. So that includes loans from multilateral development banks. It includes things like the Green Climate Fund or the Climate Investment Funds. It's not just grant donors. And in order to be meaningful and to really help the development of action, the NDC finance strategies, they need to be grounded in reality. They need to be based on sectoral studies, and they need to be fully aligned with the long-term development plans. So going back to the first slide, you really have to see how all of these documents start talking to each other and interacting with each other in order to be meaningful. You cannot have an NDC finance strategy that is at odds with a low emission development strategy that often covers the same time. That won't work. Next slide, please. Right. So coming then to the NDC itself, when we look at it from the perspective of producing the financing strategy, there needs to be a consideration: are the projects that are in there, are they really the right and the most important ones? I mean, they obviously will have to be delivered if it's a government-approved NDC, but it may not be the same kind of priority that, for example, some donors have, and then there need to be a realization of that at the finance strategy level to try to align the available donor funding with, the priority projects. And then in the finance strategy as well, is the expectation of the public-private, the conditional, non-conditional split in the financing requirements, right? And again, that will need looking at what the investment strategies of development partners are, as well as the investment strategies of the country, for example. And then one thing that is a little bit of an overhang, I think, from the original conceptualization of the NDCs is that we see sometimes that the NDCs aren't really fully reflective of what the needs are of the country, with a quite heavy weighting towards mitigation, while many countries have very high adaptation needs. I think this round of NDC updates is starting to address it, but it's still an issue. So then another document that is closely connected to the finance strategy is implementation roadmap for the NDC, which again, I think every country will need to have one, and it's broader than just projects that are being financed. The implementation roadmap includes legislative and regulatory actions that are needed in order to provide the framework in which the investments can take place, for example. And so here the question is this realistic in terms of its ambition? Is it sufficient to deliver the NDC? And is the timeline in which it's being implemented the right one? So, for example, if you think you can deliver a lot of renewable energy quickly, but the investment framework isn't right, then it's more important to fix the investment framework first rather than chasing money for renewable energy projects. And so it might be more useful than to the investment into the future of being. what has actually happened in the past. So how has the implementation of the 2015 NDC performed, and how much climate finance has been provided to a country in the past? I.e., is the forward-looking, so the next decade, is that a qualitative jump, also a quantitative jump in terms of the climate finance requirements compared to what has been provided in the past? And if that's the case, if suddenly the country would require 3 or 5 times the amount of climate finance that was provided to it from 2010 to 2020, is that realistic? Where's the money going to come from? Next slide, please. So in terms of guidance, and just to repeat some points here, it is really important that the finance strategy is very clearly aligned with the NDC and all the underlying documentation, the long-term strategies and action plans. It is really important to consider how much absorption capacity the country and the sectors have. And in order to manage that, it may be necessary to see if some investment should be pushed into the future to make sure that they can be done properly. It is important to identify the most important finance providers, both in the past, but also who it would be important to engage with for the future, and see if their agenda in the country is aligned with the NDC objectives. So look at the future strategies for the DFIs, major donors, and also check where the current plans for public investment are going. Are they aligned with the NDC? So that's where, for example, climate budget tagging comes in and can be quite an important tool. And then look at what is missing. So what kind of policies or systems are needed to deliver the NDC ambition? Do you have a renewable energy framework that allows investments? What about buildings energy efficiency? Are adaptation concerns sufficiently reflected in infrastructure planning? And then from a convention point of view, what about MRV? The biennial transparency reports, the enhanced transparency framework, is what you're trying to do fully aligned with that. And then I think there's some exciting things coming down the road for future potential for financing, and they are related to just transition, which is at the moment still primarily an in-EU issue, but I expect that to become quite important in the Eastern Partnership pretty soon as well. So the question of how are sectors of the economy that are being disadvantaged by climate change being helped. And then Article 6 trading, and there's a lot of activity there as well. But again, that could be quite interesting, despite the not necessarily great experience that some countries in the Eastern Partnership have had with carbon trading. Hopefully this time will be different. So these are processes that would be important to stay connected to and to try to also influence in a way that is positive for the region. Next slide, please. So a quick word on the on how to go about all of this for financing strategy development. It's the review of underlying policies. So, for example, I've used here Vision 2050. That's a document that the Mongolian government has, which describes the overall development vision for 2050, and it's being implemented in sort of 5-year action plans. That's actually quite helpful. Because you get both the sort of the long-term horizon view, but also the near-term, what's going to happen within a short time frame. Then look at the roadmap, the old NDC, the draft NDC or adopted NDC for the next period, and the DFI country strategies. Any sort of sector documentation that is available or hopefully has been specifically produced for the NDC. Primarily transport, energy, industry, waste, and agriculture. Agriculture including forestry, and then I think you've covered probably most of the emission and adaptation needs. Identify key projects that are already known, review historic data, and look at also the emissions data and consider whether the NDC is actually on track for being delivered. And in some countries, I think there may be some bad surprises in store, that the NDCs may be quite ambitious, but when you look at what's actually going on, the trajectory isn't near where it needs to be. So again, having looked at this in this particular country, the country seems to be off the NDC trajectory. That's a problem. There's a need to identify additional projects and bring their delivery forward in order to get back onto that trajectory. And the MRV system that is under discussion is probably insufficient because it doesn't capture the domestic effort. So that would need to be augmented, because otherwise, if you just look at what the international finance is, then you're missing a large part of the financing of the NDC. And on that note, I want to conclude. So I know we're running short on time. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have. But otherwise, we'll also have the breakout session. And, I also have if you go to the next slide, I have my contact details on here. So please feel free to reach out and or go through your country offices. And I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.